North Africa, late 1942. The desert air shimmered with heat and engine smoke. Across the barren ridges near El Alamein, dust clouds marked the advance of a new force, olive-drab tanks rumbling awkwardly over the dunes. The men of the German Afrika Korps paused to watch. From the hatches of their Panzer IVs, and the first Tiger is shipped to Tunisia, laughter drifted through the static of their radios. Amerikanische Panzer. Look at them, they're too tall, too fat. They'll make fine bonfires. It was the first time many German crews had seen the new M4 Sherman. Its high silhouette and rounded armor looked almost comical beside the squat, efficient lines of the Panzers. To the veterans of Rommel's Desert Army, men who had crushed British armor from Tobruk to Gazala, the Shermans looked like factory-made toys, naive symbols of a nation that still believed quantity could substitute for quality. The Tiger commander, Hauptmann Karl Broman, reportedly chuckled as he cleaned the dust from his binoculars. "They build tanks the way they build refrigerators," he said. "Big, loud, and easy to break." On the other side of the ridge, American crews were sweating inside their new machines, the paint still fresh from Detroit. Most had never seen combat. They were mechanics, clerks, farm boys suddenly turned tankers. Their Shermans smelled of oil, rubber, and nervous hope. Sergeant Jack Casey of the 1st Armored Division wrote home that week, "We're told the Germans have these new monsters called Tigers. The instructors say ours can take them if we stay mobile. I'm betting they know what they're talking about." Above the rumble of engines came the voice of optimism, radio chatter filled with American slang and laughter. The men believed in their machines, and in the idea that American engineering could solve any problem. The M4's transmission was smooth, its engine reliable, its turret fast. None of them yet knew that the 75mm gun they carried would bounce harmlessly off German armor. The first encounter came on November 26, 1942, near Tabourba, Tunisia. German Panzer Fifis of the 10th Panzer Division met the American Shermans of Combat Command B, 1st Armored Division. The clash was brief, brutal, and one-sided. German gunners opened fire at 2,500 meters, extreme range in desert visibility. Their high-velocity 75mm shells punched through the Shermans before the Americans were even in effective range. One after another, the new tanks erupted in orange fireballs. Ammunition cooked off. Hatches blew open like mouths screaming flame. A German after-action report recorded dryly, "The American tanks burn easily. Armor too thin, guns inadequate. Crews brave but inexperienced." To the Afrika Korps, it confirmed what they already believed. American industry could mass-produce machines, but not mastery. That evening, German mechanics sat under the stars beside their Tigers and joked about the day's engagement. A Tiger commander wrote in his diary, "The Americans send us these tall coffins on tracks. Easy to spot, easier to destroy. Their turrets turn fast, and perhaps, to give their crews more time to pray, the Tiger I was the embodiment of German confidence, a 56-ton fortress of steel with an 88mm gun that could kill a Sherman frontally at 2 kilometers. To its crews, the war was still a contest of craftsmanship, precision, and courage. The Sherman, with its welded seams and mass-produced parts, looked like an insult to that ethos. Even Rommel himself, inspecting wrecked American tanks near Medjez el Bab, remarked, "They have courage, but they are led by factories." To the German mind, it was proof that the Americans were amateurs, soft soldiers in soft machines. But between the burning wrecks, engineers from the U.S. Ordnance Department were already studying the damage. They noted where shells had struck, how armor had failed, how gasoline fires had started. The lesson was not defeat, it was data. The Americans didn't mourn long. They rebuilt faster than anyone expected. Within weeks, replacements arrived. New Shermans rolled off landing craft at Beaune and Oran by the hundreds. Each one slightly improved, better supplied, more coordinated. While German Tiger crews nursed their over-engineered machines, waiting for spare parts that never arrived, the Shermans kept coming, dusty, dented, and somehow always running. The contrast was invisible to those laughing Germans in 1942, but it was already written in the desert sand. They had built a perfect predator. America had built a species. Night falls over the desert. The Tigers sleep under tarps. their engines cooling like beasts after the hunt. Across the horizon, distant engines hum, hundreds of them, a low mechanical heartbeat rising from the ports of Algiers and Casablanca. The narrator's voice cuts through the silence. They laughed at the high silhouettes, the thin armor, the short guns. They called them fire traps, rolling coffins, amateur machines. But war does not reward elegance. It rewards endurance. What the Germans didn't know was that those awkward shapes on the horizon weren't a mistake of design. They were the future. And that future would bury the Wehrmacht under its treads. In 1940, as Europe burned under the treads of German Panzers, American engineers in Detroit faced a terrifying truth. The United States had no modern tank army. Its few armored vehicles were relics, thin-skinned, undergunned, and obsolete before they even rolled off the line. But far from the battlefront, inside the humming factories of Michigan, a new kind of war machine was being born. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had promised the world that America would become the arsenal of democracy. In Detroit, that promise took the shape of steel. Auto plants that once produced family sedans were stripped to their foundations and rebuilt into engines of war. Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors turned their conveyor belts toward the front lines. They would not just supply tanks, they would flood the world with them. At the heart of this transformation stood the Chrysler Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant, a cathedral of industry, where molten metal and human determination merged. Designed by Albert Kahn, the same architect who shaped Detroit's skyline, the Arsenal was the first factory in history built solely for tank production. Its walls trembled with the thunder of machinery, the hiss of welding torches, and the rhythm of progress that never stopped. From those lines came the M3 Lee, a hurried design born from desperation. It was tall, ungainly, and armed with two main guns that looked in opposite directions, a mechanical contradiction in motion. But the M3 was never meant to win the war. It was meant to buy time. It gave American engineers the foundation they needed to create something simpler, smarter, and infinitely more adaptable. That evolution arrived in the spring of 1941, the M4 Sherman. Its shape was unremarkable, rounded armor, a high silhouette, and a gun that looked modest compared to the German 88. Yet inside that steel shell was a revolution in engineering. Every bolt, every bearing, every pipe was standardized. A tank built in Detroit could swap parts with one built in California or welded together in England. No matter where it came from, it could fight, break, and be repaired in days, not weeks. The statistics were staggering. By 1943, the Detroit Arsenal was producing one Sherman every 30 to 40 minutes. Assembly lines stretched for half a mile, feeding a continuous river of unfinished tanks that emerged whole and roaring at the other end. The process ran day and night, men and women working 12-hour shifts under the glow of arc welders. The air smelled of hot metal, oil, and sweat. Sparks rained down like artificial lightning as turret rings were fitted, tracks mounted, and engines lowered into place with mechanical precision. A foreman at the plant said it best: "We built tanks like other people built cars. And we built them faster." The Sherman itself embodied the soul of American pragmatism. It weighed around 33 tons, powered by a Continental R975 radial engine originally designed for aircraft. 9 cylinders, air-cooled, pumping out 400 horsepower. That gave the M4 a top speed of 30 miles per hour on good ground, nearly twice that of some German heavies. Its 75mm gun could not penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor, but it fired high-explosive shells that could destroy anything else in its path. Bunkers, trucks, artillery, even infantry by the dozen. Its armor was not the thickest, but it was cleverly sloped, giving it a better chance to deflect a shell rather than absorb it. It carried 3 machine guns, 2 .30-caliber Brownings, and a turret-mounted 50-caliber that could tear through soft targets or low-flying aircraft. It was not a duelist, it was a workhorse. The Sherman's genius lay in its maintainability. Its suspension could be replaced in the field without cranes. Its engine could be swapped in hours by mechanics using standard tools. In the mud of Italy, in the jungles of the Pacific, in the hedgerows of Normandy, the M4 could always be fixed. And when it couldn't, replacements were already on the docks waiting to roll out. The German tanks were elegant predators, Panzers, Tigers, and Panthers built with precision craftsmanship. But that precision was their weakness. Each required rare metals, specialized tools, and expert crews. A Tiger took months to build and days to repair. A Sherman took hours to build and minutes to fix. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 49,000 Shermans would be produced, more tanks than Germany, Italy, and Japan built combined. Detroit's engines never slept. At peak production, Chrysler, Fisher-Body, and Press Steel Car Company turned out 1,000 tanks a month. The arsenal consumed steel by the shipload and electricity by the city. Rail cars left the factory gates in endless chains, each carrying a Sherman destined for war. One worker described it like a heartbeat that never stopped. When a tank rolled off the line, she said, the floor shook. That was the sound of victory being built. It was a victory forged not by superior design, but by relentless repetition. The Sherman was not the best tank in the world, but it was the tank the world needed. While German engineers obsessed over perfection, the Americans mastered abundance. They understood that a tank that could be produced, shipped, repaired, and replaced faster than the enemy could destroy. It was a weapon more powerful than any gun. Detroit had created something the Axis powers could never match, a machine that multiplied itself, and as the months passed, the thunder of Detroit's tank army grew louder. Each Sherman that rolled out was another heartbeat of the arsenal of democracy, an army of steel born not in the trenches, but on the assembly lines of America. The Germans would call them clumsy, crude, and inferior. But the factories of Detroit didn't care. They just kept building, because in modern war it wasn't the best machine that won. It was the one that never stopped coming. The sun over Tunisia was a burning disk of brass, and beneath it, war machines moved like insects across the desert. It was November 1942, and the Americans had come to North Africa, green, untested, and full of confidence. Their new weapon, the M4 Sherman, had rolled off the ships of Operation Torch, gleaming in fresh olive paint, its white stars clean and bright against the endless sand. To the men of the U.S. 1st Armored Division, it felt like the dawn of a new era. The Sherman was faster, smoother, and more reliable than anything they had trained with back home. Mechanics called it a dream to maintain. Officers praised its speed and communication systems. And for the young crews, farmhands from Iowa, mechanics from Detroit, clerks from New York, it was a fortress that moved. They believed it could stand against anything. But waiting beyond the dunes were men who had already mastered the art of armored war. The Africa Corps, battle-hardened veterans who had crushed British armor from Tobruk to El Alamein, now turned their guns toward the Americans. They were led by Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, whose name was already legend. His panzers were veterans of Europe's killing grounds. Their gunners could judge range by instinct. Their tactics were carved from years of blood and sand. The Americans met them for the first time near Tiburba and Jadeda, at the edge of Tunisia's narrow valleys. The desert fell silent for a moment, then the air split with the sound of German 75mm shells. A single hit could tear a Sherman open like a tin can. American crews, still maneuvering into formation, were stunned by how far away the enemy could fire. From more than a mile and a half, the German Panzer IVs struck with terrifying precision. Shells screamed in from invisible ranges, slamming through armor and igniting the Sherman's fuel tanks. Flames shot from the hatches, licking across the desert wind. Crews bailed out, some burning, some blinded by smoke. To the Germans, it was almost sport. In his after-action report, a German tank commander wrote coldly, "The new American tanks burn easily. Thin armor, poor training. We call them Tommy cookers. They ignite like stoves." The name stuck, spreading through the Africa Corps like a cruel joke. Tommy cookers, Ronsons, because, as one German joked, they light every time. In those first weeks, the Americans learned what every Allied tanker feared, the German 88. Originally designed as an anti-aircraft gun, the 88mm cannon had become Rommel's executioner. Mounted on Tiger Is or hidden in dug-in emplacements, it could punch through a Sherman's frontal armor at 2,000 yards, twice the range at which the Americans could return fire. At Jadeda, a platoon of Shermans advanced across open ground, unaware that German gunners had zeroed in on them. The first shell struck the lead tank, blowing off its turret in a fireball that lit the sand. The second sliced through 2 tanks in a single shot, exiting one and entering the next. Within minutes, the formation was gone. Private Charles Red Harmon, a loader from Kentucky, recalled the horror. "We didn't even see where it came from. 1 second we were rolling, next we were burning. I thought I was dead before I even knew we were hit." By the end of December 1942, American armored losses in Tunisia numbered in the hundreds. Entire battalions were shattered before they could get within firing distance. German radio intercepts mocked the newcomers. One message read simply, "The Americans drive bravely to their deaths." Yet even as their tanks burned, something remarkable was happening. The Shermans that survived kept fighting. Many came home riddled with holes, tracks shattered, turrets jammed, but they came home. Mechanics worked through the night to patch them together with scrap metal, welding plates from wrecked vehicles, cannibalizing parts from the dead to keep the living moving. Within days, tanks that had been written off were back on the line. Unlike the German Panzers, the Shermans didn't break down as often. Their engines started in the morning. Their transmissions held up under desert dust, and their radios, standard in every vehicle, allowed commanders to coordinate maneuvers on a scale the Germans weren't used to. Slowly, painfully, the Americans learned. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, the Americans faced their greatest humiliation. Rommel struck with precision, his panzers slicing through green troops who had never seen combat. The Shermans were caught in ambushes, their formations collapsing under fire from Tigers and 88s. The desert floor was littered with burning wrecks and abandoned vehicles. But while the headlines back home called it a disaster, the truth was more complex. The Americans didn't break, they adapted. After Kasserine, General Dwight D. Eisenhower replaced weak commanders, reorganized logistics and ordered intensive retraining. New tactics were forged in fire. Never attack alone, use artillery support, and above all, use numbers and communication to overwhelm the enemy. The Sherman's design, once mocked, proved invaluable in this learning curve. Its mobility allowed rapid flanking maneuvers. Its radios let platoons coordinate strikes faster than the Germans could react. And while Tigers and Panzers waited for fuel or spare parts, Sherman simply refueled, rearmed, and rolled again. By the spring of 1943, those lessons were paying off. At El Gueta, the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion ambushed a German column, using terrain and coordination to even the odds. Shermans worked alongside infantry and artillery, hammering the enemy with relentless precision. German reports began to note a change. The American tank units show improved discipline. Their cooperation with artillery is deadly. The desert had forged them. In one engagement near Gafsa, a company of Shermans maneuvered in wide arcs, using their speed to flank a group of Panzer I-4s. When the Germans tried to pivot, the Americans struck from both sides. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. 5 Panzers destroyed. The Americans lost 3, but for the first time they didn't retreat. A German tanker later admitted, "They keep coming. You knock one out and another appears. It's like fighting the sea." That relentlessness became the Sherman's signature. It didn't need to win duels. It just had to survive long enough for reinforcements, for air cover, for artillery to arrive. Every hour it stayed in the fight was another hour the Germans lost ground. When Tunisia finally fell in May 1943, the Americans had paid for every mile in blood and steel. Thousands of wrecked tanks littered the landscape, but new ones were already arriving on the docks at Bizerte and Algiers. The lessons learned in North Africa would soon carry them to Sicily, to Italy, and eventually to the shores of Normandy. The German tankers who had once laughed at the Tommy cookers were starting to notice a pattern. The Americans never ran out of tanks. The desert campaign had begun as a humiliation, but it ended as a revelation. The Sherman might burn, but it never truly died. It could be repaired, replaced, reborn faster than the Germans could destroy it. Its crews were no longer the wide-eyed novices who had first rolled off the transports. They were veterans now, hardened, scarred, and ready. The first trial by fire had nearly destroyed them. Instead, it forged the army that would come back for Europe. And as the last German columns retreated toward the sea, the desert wind carried a new sound, the steady, defiant rumble of Shermans still moving forward. By the summer of 1943, the Sherman had fought its way from the sands of North Africa to the rocky hills of Sicily. The lessons of Tunisia were written in fire. Tanks burned, crews died, but the machines never stopped coming. And now, under the punishing Sicilian sun, the Americans and British were about to discover what truly made their tank different. It wasn't the gun or the armor. It was the fact that the Sherman simply refused to die. Outside the village of Troina, a column of Shermans from the U.S. 2nd Armored Division crept forward through olive groves. The Germans were waiting, veterans of the Hermann Göring Division, supported by the dreaded Tiger Worms. The first shot from a Tiger's 88mm gun hit the lead Sherman square in the glacis plate, tearing through the hull. But instead of stopping the advance, the next tank rolled over the burning wreck and kept firing. The Tiger reloaded. Another hit. Another Sherman lost, but the column didn't break. By the end of the fight, the road was littered with blackened steel and burning fuel, but the Americans had taken the ridge. Out of 20 tanks, 9 were destroyed. 11 were running again by sunset. Mechanics arrived before the fires had even gone out. A German officer observing the battle wrote later, "The American tanks seem endless. You destroy one and another appears behind it." Their recovery units work like ants, that was the secret. Where the Germans built machines for perfection, the Americans built a system for survival. In the Sicilian campaign, Shermans faced not just German guns, but the land itself. Dust-clogged filters, fuel lines cracked in the heat, engines overheated. Yet the radial engines of the M4 rarely failed. If they did, the fix was simple. Crews carried spare spark plugs, filters, and even head gaskets. A Sherman could limp back on one track, or with half its road wheels missing. And when it couldn't move under its own power, another Sherman would tow it back. At night, under blackout tarps, mechanics went to work. They patched holes with scavenged steel, replaced broken bogies, and welded on new armor plates cut from wrecks. By morning, a tank that had been hit 3 times the day before was rolling again, scarred but alive. In the same days, the Germans fought their own battle against time. The Tiger Y, a marvel of engineering, was also a nightmare to maintain. Its complex transmission and overstrained suspension constantly failed in the rocky Sicilian terrain. At one point, during the retreat from Mount Etna, an entire company of Tigers was abandoned, not destroyed by enemy fire, but by their own mechanical hearts giving out. The crews, out of fuel and parts, destroyed their tanks with demolition charges and escaped on foot. An American intelligence report captured the irony perfectly. The German Tiger is a fine machine, but it dies in the workshop, not on the field. From Sicily, the Allied advance pushed to Salerno, the gateway to Italy. The beaches there turned into a slaughterhouse. German anti-tank guns lined the ridges. Tigers prowled inland roads. The landing forces took staggering losses in the first hours. Captain Bill Larson, commanding a Sherman of the 756th Tank Battalion, recalled the chaos. "The first 88 hit the tank next to us. It blew the turret clean off. We didn't even look, we just kept moving. You couldn't stop. You stop, you die." His own tank took 2 hits that day, one through the track, another through the rear armor. But the engine kept running. They reversed behind a ridge, smoke pouring from the hatches. The crew doused the fire, patched a fuel line with a rag, and drove back into the fight an hour later. Larson's gunner, Corporal Steve Harlow, later wrote home, "It's a good thing she's ugly. The Germans can't believe she still runs." By September, the Shermans had carved their way inland, their sides scored with impact marks. Many carried patches of welded armor, crude field modifications the crews called appliques. Some tanks had entire doors or ship plates bolted to their hulls for extra protection. Others had sandbags piled on their fronts, or spare track links welded as makeshift shields. The tanks looked battered, but they moved with the same confidence as the day they left Detroit. And always, there were more coming. The British, fighting alongside the Americans in Italy, came to trust the M4 for reasons far beyond its performance. It wasn't glamorous, but it was there, always there. One British tanker of the 3rd County of London Yeomanry summed it up perfectly. "We lost tanks every day, but never the same ones twice." The British had fought too long with underpowered Crusaders and Valentines that broke before the enemy could. The Sherman was a revelation. Its engine started in the cold, Its gearboxes didn't seize, and when it did break, spare parts were never far behind. The Allied supply chain had turned logistics into a weapon. Each division had mobile repair depots, following closely behind the front. Damaged Shermans were hauled by recovery tanks to these field workshops, where crews of engineers worked around the clock. Engines were swapped, armor patched, guns realigned, all under canvas tents within sight of the front lines. In some cases, a tank knocked out in the morning was back in battle by nightfall. For the Germans, that concept was unthinkable. Their tanks were masterpieces of precision, but their spare parts were scarce, their factories bombed, their fuel lines collapsing under Allied airstrikes. The Wehrmacht could still win battles, but it couldn't keep fighting them. By late 1943, German units in Italy began reporting a new frustration. Intelligence notes captured from Panzer Grenadier headquarters read, "Enemy tank forces show remarkable persistence. They do not retreat when hit, but repair and return. Impossible to reduce permanently." It was true. At Salerno, an American tank commander named Lieutenant Robert Kane survived 4 direct hits on his Sherman during one engagement. 2 shells struck the turret, another tore through the engine deck, and the last shattered the commander's periscope. The armor held long enough for Kane and his crew to fight back, destroying 2 German guns before withdrawing. When the smoke cleared, his tank, named Stubborn Jill, was still running, leaking oil and riddled with holes, but alive. Kane refused to abandon it. 2 days later, after a field repair, Stubborn Jill was back in action. The Germans nicknamed the Sherman Die Zähe machine, the Stubborn Machine. The Allies took that as a compliment. By the winter of 1943, as the fighting pushed north through Italy's mountain passes, the Sherman had earned a reputation that even its critics couldn't deny. It was not the best tank on paper, but in the mud, in the dust, and under fire, it was the one that kept going. For every Tiger that broke down, 3 Shermans took its place. For every Panther that ran out of fuel, a Sherman rolled past with full tanks and spare drums strapped to its sides. The Germans fought for perfection. The Americans fought for persistence, and persistence won. When historians later studied the campaigns of Sicily and Salerno, they found the pattern repeated across every battlefield: the Sherman that was hit, repaired, and sent back again. Crews who swore they'd seen their tanks last day were climbing into the same scorched seats a week later. Mechanics kept count of how many times a tank had been resurrected, painting small wrench symbols beside the gun barrel like victory marks. Each scar told a story of survival. Each patch of welded armor was proof of defiance. The Tiger was a predator. The Sherman was a survivor. And in a war that would soon stretch across continents, survival would prove to be the deadliest weapon of all. The dawn of June 6, 1944, broke over the English Channel in a haze of smoke and salt. Beneath the overcast skies, the greatest armada in human history gathered. More than 5,000 ships carried men, machines, and the promise of liberation. And hidden within that armada, beneath tarps and camouflage nets, was the beating heart of the Allied invasion, over 1,500 M4 Sherman tanks. When the first landing craft ground against the sands of Omaha and Gold Beach, the steel tide began to roll ashore. Shermans roared from their landing craft into waist-deep surf, their engines howling, their tracks clawing for traction. Some drowned immediately, water flooding their exhausts, waves swallowing them whole. Others made it onto the beach and pushed through burning wreckage, climbing over obstacles as artillery fire turned the shoreline into a furnace. For the soldiers struggling to survive the chaos of D-Day, the sight of those tanks was salvation. A Sherman, even half submerged and shell-struck, meant cover, protection, movement. It was a symbol that the Americans had arrived not as a trickle, but as a flood. The Germans on the cliffs had expected infantry. What they saw instead was a mechanical invasion. The radio chatter among panzer commanders that morning was disbelief turning to alarm. Reports flooded back to higher command. Enemy armor present in large numbers. More tanks than we can count, they were right. By the end of the first week, nearly 2,000 Shermans were rolling through the hedgerows of Normandy. It was an invasion of machines as much as men. The Wehrmacht's commanders, hardened veterans of 4 years of conquest, had never faced such numbers. On paper, the German tanks were still superior. The Panther and Tiger, were mechanical giants, Their 75 meters and 88 meters high-velocity guns could destroy a Sherman at 2 kilometers. The Shermans, by contrast, needed to get within 800 meters for a chance to penetrate. To the Germans, this seemed like a death sentence for the Americans. But the Germans were about to learn what inferior tank superior strategy truly meant. The Sherman's secret weapon wasn't its gun or its armor. It was its brain, the radio. Every Sherman had one, allowing instantaneous coordination between tankers, infantry, and artillery. German Panzers, by contrast, often relied on hand signals or shouted commands over battlefield noise. In Normandy's maze of hedgerows, communication meant survival. The Shermans began to hunt in packs. When a German Tiger revealed its position with a thunderous shot, one Sherman would pin it with fire, while 2 others flanked from the sides. One tank might die, sometimes 2, but the third would get the kill. This was the new math of war. At Villers-Bocage, that deadly arithmetic played out in blood and smoke. On June 13, 1944, a column of British Shermans from the 7th Armored Division, the famed Desert Rats, rolled into the small Norman town. Waiting for them, concealed behind garden walls, was SS tank ace Michael Wittmann in his Tiger 007. In minutes, his gunfire tore through the lead Shermans, setting them ablaze. One after another, they exploded in brilliant fireballs. The British column was shattered, but even in defeat, the Allies adapted. Within days, Shermans and Fireflies, British modified variants armed with powerful 17-pounder guns, returned to Villers-Bocage. They struck from multiple directions, coordinating through radio to box in the Tigers. Wittmann's Tiger was destroyed weeks later near Sinto, vaporized by a flanking Sherman's shot. The hunter had become the hunted. Elsewhere, the Americans learned the same lesson in their own blood. In the hedgerow country around St. Lo, U.S. tank crews fought a different kind of war. One fought at point-blank range. The thick Norman bocage turned every field into a trap. Tigers and Panthers waited behind the hedges, ambushing advancing Shermans with brutal precision. But the Americans adapted faster than anyone expected. They welded sharpened steel rhino tusks to the fronts of their tanks, allowing them to smash through hedgerows instead of climbing over them. Now, instead of being ambushed, the Shermans burst through like battering rams, catching the Germans by surprise. From above, Allied air superiority turned the battlefield into a 3-dimensional nightmare for the Wehrmacht. P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoon fighter bombers roared overhead, armed with rockets that could split a tank in half. Whenever a German formation tried to regroup, the sky itself struck them down. The Tiger's armor couldn't stop a rocket from heaven. For the Sherman crews, it was still a brutal, intimate war. Sergeant Lafayette Poole of the 3rd Armored Division, a Texas-born tanker with a calm drawl and deadly aim, became one of the most feared tank commanders in Europe. Between June and September 1944, Poole's crew destroyed an astonishing 258 enemy vehicles, including tanks, armored cars, and artillery positions. He fought from 3 different Shermans, all destroyed in combat, but always came back in another. His crew named their tanks In the Mood. The first was wrecked by a mine. The second was hit by a Panzerfaust. The third fought until September, when it was torn apart by an ambush. Lafayette Poole survived them all. When asked how he did it, he said, "The tank dies, but we don't." Every crew knew that truth. The Sherman wasn't just a machine, it was a lifeboat that could burn and still bring its men home. By late June, the full weight of American industry was rolling across France. 30,000 tons of fuel and ammunition arrived every day. Replacement tanks came faster than the Germans could destroy them. If one Sherman burned in a hedgerow, another landed at Cherbourg the next morning. The Germans had no answer for that kind of endurance. A Tiger division might field 40 tanks at full strength. An American armored division had more than 200, and behind it waited the factories of Detroit, still producing a new Sherman every 40 minutes. At the tactical level, German crews fought with courage and skill, but each engagement was a war of attrition they couldn't afford. A Panther might destroy 5 Shermans before being knocked out, but there were always 10 more Shermans waiting. The Allies turned that imbalance into doctrine. They used artillery and air support to pin the enemy, then swarmed with armor. Shermans flanked from both sides, their radios buzzing with constant updates. Tiger sighted, flank left. Fire for effect. Move, move, move! By July, the hedgerows were no longer killing fields. They were corridors of victory. The breakout from Saint-Lô, codenamed Operation Cobra, unleashed the full power of American mobility. The roads filled with Shermans, tank destroyers, half-tracks, and trucks, a river of steel that stretched to the horizon. When the breakout began on July 25th, Allied bombers dropped more than 4,000 tons of explosives ahead of the tank lines. The earth itself convulsed. Then the Shermans rolled forward, hundreds of them cresting the smoke-choked ridges like a tide made of iron. German defenses simply disintegrated. Overwhelmed and outnumbered, Panther and Tiger crews fought desperate delaying actions, firing until their guns melted, then abandoning their tanks for lack of fuel. One captured German lieutenant confessed after the battle, "We didn't know how to fight them anymore. They come from all directions, always more of them. It is like trying to stop the ocean." By August, that ocean had swept across Normandy. The Falaise pocket became a graveyard of burning armor. Thousands of wrecked German vehicles, columns of prisoners and craters filled with twisted metal. The Luftwaffe was gone. The roads were open. When the smoke cleared, the Allies had advanced 100 miles in less than 2 weeks. Paris was next. For all its flaws, its thin armor, its tendency to burn, its smaller gun, the Sherman had done what no other tank in history had achieved. It had turned war into momentum, where the Tiger was a weapon. The Sherman was a wave, unstoppable, endless, fueled by the engines of an entire nation. As the columns rolled eastward through the ruins of Normandy, their tracks grinding over the broken stones of conquered villages, one thought united every German tanker who saw them coming: the Americans don't stop. The steel tide had come to Europe, and it would not recede until it reached Berlin. By the autumn of 1944, the battlefield of Europe had become a chessboard of metal beasts. The Germans still held their pride: the Tiger I, the Tiger II, and the sleek, deadly Panther. Each one was a masterpiece of steel and engineering. But the Allies, through fire and blood, had begun to understand how to kill them. The fear that once gripped Sherman crews at the sight of an 88mm muzzle flash was fading. Experience, paid for in burnt-out hulls and buried friends, was transforming into mastery. The Allies were learning to fight, not with fear, but with intellect. At first, the Tiger had seemed invincible. Its 88mm gun could punch through a Sherman from over a mile away. Its armor could shrug off anything the 75mm American gun could deliver. In those early duels, single Tigers destroyed entire platoons. The desert humiliation of 1942 had returned in Normandy's hedgerows, but the difference now was that the Americans and British had stopped thinking like prey. Allied tacticians studied every wreck, every survivor's account, every German after-action report. Patterns emerged. The Tiger was deadly from the front but clumsy in motion. Its slow turret traverse, its heavy tracks, its limited visibility, all weaknesses waiting to be exploited. The solution was brutal in its simplicity: don't fight fair. Don't duel a Tiger, hunt it. At field headquarters, tank commanders began drawing circles in the dirt. The new formation would be called the Wolf Pack. 3 or 4 Shermans moving as one organism. One would bait the Tiger, another would distract it, and the rest would flank. The first tank to spot the enemy would report coordinates over the radio, something the German crews rarely had. When the Tiger fired, its position was revealed. The moment its turret swung toward one Sherman, the others would move, circling like wolves. Outmaneuvering, not overpowering. Lieutenant Frank Morales of the 4th Armored Division described it perfectly. The Tiger was a lion. We became wolves. The new tactics spread quickly across the Western Front. At Saint-Lô, the 3rd Armored Division executed one of the first successful pack hunts. A German Tiger fired from a ridge, knocking out the lead Sherman instantly. But instead of scattering, the other 3 tanks split wide. One drove forward, drawing the Tiger's aim, while the others flanked left and right. The Tiger's turret turned, too slowly. 2 Shermans opened fire into its thinner side armor. The second round pierced the fuel tank. The Tiger erupted in flame. The crew escaped, blackened and dazed. American infantry moved in to capture them. A sergeant later recalled their disbelief. They said it shouldn't have been possible. They called us reckless fools. Maybe we were, but it worked. That same pattern repeated across the front. When single Shermans fought alone, they died. When they hunted together, the odds shifted. And they weren't hunting alone. Above them, the roar of engines filled the sky. The unmistakable sound of P-47 Thunderbolts and British Typhoons, armed with rockets and 20mm cannons. Allied air power had become the great equalizer. Tankers learned to fight with their eyes on the clouds as much as on the horizon. Radio operators called in airstrikes the moment a Tiger or Panther was spotted. A single rocket from a Thunderbolt could split a tank open like fruit. Captain Joseph Link, an American forward observer, once described a joint strike. We had a Tiger holding the crossroads. 3 Shermans were pinned down, couldn't even peek without getting hit. Then the P-47s came. First one missed, second hit dead on. The Tiger flipped like a child's toy. The Germans began to fear the sky. Their armored columns moved only at night, hiding under trees by day. Whenever a Tiger was spotted, Allied artillery and aircraft converged. It wasn't just tanks killing Tigers anymore. It was a synchronized orchestra of destruction. The British, meanwhile, brought their own innovation to the hunt, the Sherman Firefly. Outwardly similar to its American cousin, but armed with the legendary British 17-pounder, a gun that could penetrate even a Tiger's frontal armor at 1,500 meters. The first time the Firefly entered combat, German tankers didn't know what they were facing. At a distance, it looked like another ordinary Sherman. That mistake proved fatal. Outside of Caen, a German Tiger platoon spotted 3 Shermans crossing open ground. The Tiger commander ordered fire. 1 Sherman exploded immediately, but the last in line, the Firefly, held its ground. The gunner took careful aim through the scope. A flash, a crack, and the Tiger's turret exploded, flung from its hull. It was the first confirmed long-range Tiger kill by a Firefly. The British commander radioed back to his unit. "We've found the answer to their monsters." From that day on, German reports began marking Sherman with long gun as high-priority targets. The Allies responded by camouflaging Firefly barrels with white paint near the muzzle, making them appear shorter, another deception in a war now defined by cunning rather than brute strength. As the Shermans adapted, the Tiger's advantages began to turn against it. It was too heavy for most bridges, too slow to redeploy, too fuel-hungry to fight prolonged battles. Each lost Tiger was irreplaceable. Each lost Sherman was a statistic. Ter captured German commander. Oberstleutnant Hans von Bülow put it bitterly after his surrender. "They fight in packs. We fight alone. They die by the dozen and still come. We die once, and the line is broken." The Allies had turned their supposed weakness and mass production into a tactical doctrine. A Sherman could be repaired in hours, replaced in days. A Tiger once destroyed was gone forever. By late 1944, the results were undeniable. Allied tank units that had once been chewed apart were now overwhelming German positions. Shermans advanced in coordinated waves, supported by artillery barrages and fighter bombers circling overhead. The rhythm of combat had changed. The Germans, once masters of mechanized warfare, now found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. In the Ardennes, during the opening stages of the Battle of the Bulge, an American unit used wolfpack tactics to destroy 4 Tiger IIs, the new King Tigers. They used the terrain, smoke and coordination, striking from multiple directions while calling in artillery to box the monsters in. When the smoke cleared, the field was littered with burning wrecks. One of the surviving German crewmen, later interrogated, said simply, "It was not fighting. It was drowning." The transformation was complete. The fear that had once haunted Allied tankers, the stories of invincible German steel, had been replaced by confidence, even defiance. Sherman crews now painted nicknames on their turrets: Tiger Tamer, Steel Wolf, German Repellent. They knew they were still outgunned, but no longer outmatched. Sergeant Lafayette Poole, now a legend among his peers, led his crew through the French countryside like a hunter stalking prey. In 1 week of August 1944, his tank destroyed 10 enemy armored vehicles, 5 artillery pieces and dozens of trucks. His crew operated like clockwork, loader, gunner, driver, all perfectly in sync. Poole's words became doctrine: hit first, hit fast, and never stop moving. That was the Sherman's new gospel: mobility, communication, coordination, and the courage to work as one machine with many hands. By the end of 1944, the myth of German invincibility was dead. The Allies had learned to kill tigers, not through superior technology, but through unity, discipline, and relentless adaptation. The Tiger was still the better tank, but the Sherman had become the better weapon, and as the armies pushed toward the Rhine, the men who once feared the 88 began to see it differently. The sound of that gun no longer froze them, it provoked them. Because now they knew what to do. For the first time since the war began, the hunters had become the hunted. July 1944. The fields of Normandy were burning. For 7 weeks, the Allied armies had been locked in a death grip with the German defenders. Every hedgerow, every farmhouse, every patch of earth had been paid for in blood. The American advance had stalled in a maze of narrow lanes and thick earth walls, a natural fortress the Germans called bocage. The rain turned roads to rivers, the air thick with the stench of cordite and death. But behind the lines, an enormous machine was gathering momentum. The order had come from General Omar Bradley, Operation Cobra. The goal was simple: to break out of Normandy and shatter the German front. The method was industrial war in motion. At dawn on July 25th, the sky itself became a weapon. Thousands of American bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, and medium B-26 Marauders roared over the front line. Their engines shook the earth. Below, the Shermans waited, hatches sealed, crews crouched in silence as the ground began to tremble. The first bombs fell at 9:40 a.m. A wall of fire rolled across the German positions near St. Lo. Trees vanished, trenches collapsed, tanks were thrown into the air like toys. Over 3,000 tons of explosives dropped in less than an hour. For the men in the Shermans, it was like watching the world end. Sergeant Bill Bowles of the 2nd Armored Division later said, "The sky came down on them. When the dust lifted, there was nothing left but holes and ghosts." Then came the order: advance. The Shermans moved forward, dozens, then hundreds, their engines roaring in unison. Bulldozer tanks led the way, their heavy blades carving through hedgerows that had stopped entire divisions weeks before. Behind them came the M4s, bursting through gaps with infantry clinging to their sides. The dust and smoke turned the daylight orange. Each tank commander stared through periscopes at a world gone mad: burned trees, shattered houses, dead cattle, and the twisted hulks of German armor. Yet still, the Shermans rolled forward. The Germans, stunned by the bombardment, tried to rally. Survivors from the Panzer Lehr Division, once one of Germany's finest armored formations, crawled from the craters, dazed and deafened. They grabbed their rifles, manned their guns, and waited for the Americans to enter the kill zones. But there were no kill zones left. The landscape itself had been erased. At 10 a.m., the first counterfire began. A handful of Panthers and Tigers, positioned on the high ground near Marigny, opened up with 88mm guns. Their shells tore through the dust clouds, hitting the leading Shermans. The first tanks burst into flame, their crews spilling out and diving for ditches. But the others didn't stop. One by one, they fired back. Smoke rounds filled the air, blinding the German gunners. The Shermans flanked left and right, moving like a living organism, a steel tide rolling over the chaos. The radio chatter was constant. "Tiger, 11 o'clock. 2 rounds he. Flank him, flank him." An observer described it as a storm made of engines. Within hours, the Americans had broken through. The 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions poured through the breach, followed by columns of trucks, artillery, and infantry. What had begun as a narrow assault turned into an avalanche. From above, P-47 Thunderbolts screamed down from the clouds, firing rockets into retreating German convoys. Typhoon fighter bombers from the RAF joined in, their 20mm cannons shredding anything that moved. Her German lieutenant later wrote, "We were buried under steel. Their planes were everywhere, their tanks were endless. It was not war, it was extermination. The Panzer Lehr Division ceased to exist. More than half its tanks and vehicles were destroyed in a single day. Its commander, General Fritz Bayerlin, barely escaped with his life. By nightfall, the German front had disintegrated. American engineers widened the gaps with bulldozers, clearing wrecks and debris. The columns kept moving. M4 Shermans, half-tracks, tank destroyers, trucks, an unending procession of machinery. Headlights glowed dim through the smoke as the army advanced into the open country beyond Saint-Lô. It was the moment everyone had been waiting for. After 7 weeks of grinding attrition, the Americans were finally free of the hedgerows. And when the Shermans reached open ground, their true power was unleashed. The M4 was built for movement. Its engines ran hot but steady, its tracks wide enough for the soft Norman soil, its transmission smooth even after hours of combat. German Tigers, by contrast, struggled to redeploy. Their immense weight snapped bridges, their engines overheated, their fuel lines ran dry. At Roncy, a German armored column tried to counterattack. Dozens of Panthers and Tigers lined up along the road, waiting for orders. But the orders never came when Allied fighter bombers had cut the communication lines. The first P-47s appeared minutes later, diving through the clouds, dropping 500-pound bombs and firing rockets into the jammed convoy. In less than 20 minutes, the road became a river of fire. When American tanks reached the site the next day, they counted over 250 destroyed German vehicles. One Sherman driver recalled, "It was like driving through the skeleton of an army." The breakout gained momentum faster than anyone expected. By July 27th, American spearheads had advanced more than 15 miles. The Germans, low on fuel, ammunition and morale, were retreating in chaos. For every Tiger still fighting, there were 50 Shermans rolling forward. The arithmetic of war had turned against the Reich. A German Panzer officer captured near Coutances said bitterly, "We fight for every tank. They fight with factories. We repair one, they send 100. He wasn't exaggerating. At that very moment, replacement Shermans were arriving in Normandy faster than they could be destroyed. Detroit's production lines never stopped. One new tank every 40 minutes, day and night. The Allies turned that abundance into a weapon. Supply convoys stretched for miles, fuel, shells, spare parts, food. The Germans, crippled by fuel shortages, abandoned tanks by the dozens, their empty hulks littering the roadsides. By the end of July, the Americans had ripped a 40-mile gap in the German line. The 4th Armored Division surged through it, racing south toward Avranches. The once mighty Wehrmacht was collapsing, its divisions encircled and cut off. Photographs from the days that followed show the scale of destruction. Rows of burnt Tigers lined the roads, their turrets blown off, their tracks melted into the asphalt. The air stank of fuel and death. Yet through that devastation, the Shermans kept moving, their engines humming like a chorus of mechanical thunder. For the Germans, the war had become a nightmare of attrition. For the Americans, it was proof of their doctrine. Mobility is victory. Each tank carried the same message painted on its hull, names like Thunderbolt, Hell on Wheels, Rebels Roar. They weren't elegant, but they were unstoppable. As the advance surged toward Brittany, the German command tried one last stand at Mortain. On August 7th, 5 Panzer divisions, including elite SS units, counterattacked to cut the American spearhead. But the Allies were ready. P-47 Thunderbolts struck again, their bombs annihilating the German columns before they could even reach the front. General Bradley described it simply. "We smashed them with the weight of everything we had: air, armor, artillery, and numbers." In less than a week, Operation Cobra transformed the war in the West. From static trench fighting to open mechanized warfare, the Allies had unleashed the power of industrial war. The German army, once the master of blitzkrieg and was now its victim. The fields of Normandy, once green, were now scarred black with the wrecks of German armor. Tigers burned alongside Panthers, their thick armor glowing red from the heat. Beside them rolled endless Shermans, passing wreck after wreck, each tank carrying fresh ammunition, fuel, and determination. One American tanker, looking out over the horizon, said, "It's like watching a river made of steel, and it only flows one way. That river would not stop until it reached the Seine, and beyond it, Paris." The German generals who once mocked the clumsy American tank were silent now. Their machines, once symbols of dominance, were smoking carcasses in the dust. The Shermans had buried them through sheer will and endless numbers. Quantity had become a quality of its own. Operation Cobra was not just a victory. It was the moment when momentum itself became a weapon, when the machine that wouldn't die finally learned how to run. And as night fell on the wreckage of the German army, the horizon glowed with the fires of burning tanks and the silhouettes of Shermans rolling east, engines roaring, unstoppable. The tide had broken the line, and now it was coming for the heart of Germany. December 1944. The Ardennes forest lay buried beneath a suffocating blanket of snow. Pines bowed under the weight of ice. Engines froze in their mounts. Men shivered in foxholes carved from frozen mud. The war in Europe was supposed to be winding down. Berlin felt within reach. But then, on the morning of December 16th, the silence of winter shattered. Out of the fog and snow came the last roar of the German war machine. Over 250,000 men, thousands of guns, and hundreds of tanks, among them a new monster, the Königstiger, the King Tiger. It was larger, thicker, deadlier than any tank the Allies had ever faced. And leading the defense against it, scattered and unprepared, were the Shermans. At first, the Americans thought it was a local raid. Then entire divisions vanished. The German counter-offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, had punched a hole 50 miles wide in the Allied front. Towns that had been quiet the night before were suddenly overrun by panzers rolling through snow-choked roads. Near St. Vith, a column of Shermans from the 9th Armored Division found themselves staring down a platoon of the new Tiger IIs. The King Tiger's 88mm gun fired at twice the range of the Sherman's 76mm. Its armor, nearly 8 inches thick in places, was immune to frontal attack. The first American rounds bounced off harmlessly, sparking against its hull. The Tigers fired back, and 3 Shermans went up in flames. Lieutenant Harry Sloat, watching from his command cupola, recalled, "It felt like fighting gods. Every shot they fired shook the ground. Every one of ours felt like throwing stones at a wall." But the Shermans didn't retreat. They couldn't. Their orders were to delay, to buy time for the infantry to dig in and the skies to clear. They began to fight dirty. In the tight forest roads, the King Tigers were blind giants. Their turrets turned slowly, their engines strained against the cold. Their massive tracks broke on narrow bridges. The Shermans began to circle, using speed and agility as weapons. One tank would dart from cover, fire smoke shells and lure the Tiger's aim. Another would flank through the trees close to within 100 yards and aim for the thinner rear armor. A Sherman commander radioed after one such engagement, "We can't outrun them. We can't outgun them, but by God we can outthink them." The snowstorm raged for days. Temperatures dropped below 22 degrees. Fuel froze in lines. Oil turned to sludge. Men fought frostbite as fiercely as they fought the enemy. The Shermans, built for speed and reliability, began to suffer. Engines refused to start. Turrets jammed with ice. Crews slept inside their tanks, huddled around heaters, terrified the cold would kill them before the Germans did. In Bastogne, a small Belgian town ringed by forests, the 101st Airborne and elements of the 10th Armored Division held the crossroads that the Germans needed. If Bastogne fell, the entire front would collapse. The King Tigers surrounded them from the east, hammering the defenses with artillery. Inside the perimeter, the Shermans dug in, their hulls half buried in snow, forming part of the defensive ring. Crews worked through the night to camouflage their tanks with whitewash paint, the smell of gasoline thick in the freezing air. Ammunition was low, food was scarce. Sergeant John Red Murphy, whose tank Lucky 7 had already survived North Africa and Normandy, wrote in his journal, "The cold hurts worse than shrapnel. We burn everything we can find to stay alive, even German uniforms, but we're still here. That's what matters." For a week, the Shermans held Bastogne. When German tanks tried to break through, the defenders used every trick they'd learned since Normandy. smoke, coordination, and movement. When visibility dropped, they used sound. The crew of one Sherman, positioned at the town's edge, listened for the growl of German engines, waited for the echo of tracks on frozen road, then fired point-blank into the fog. The Germans called for surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe gave his legendary reply, "Nuts." But by December 23rd, even the defiance began to fade. Ammunition was nearly gone. The wounded were freezing to death in field hospitals. The King Tigers pressed closer, their guns shelling the town from every direction. The end seemed inevitable. Then the weather broke, the clouds lifted, and with them came salvation, a roar from above. Hundreds of Allied aircraft filled the sky, dropping supplies, bombs, and rockets. P-47 Thunderbolts screamed over the battlefield, hunting tigers in the open snowfields. Their rockets turned the frozen ground into firestorms. A pilot of the 405th Fighter Group later described it. The tigers looked like monuments out there in the white. We didn't have to find them. We just followed the smoke. One by one, the King Tigers fell, immobilized, destroyed, or abandoned when their fuel ran out. The frozen roads that had hidden them now betrayed them. American artillery, guided by radio from Sherman crews, pounded the forests where the German columns tried to retreat. On December 26th, the siege of Bastogne was broken. The 4th Armored Division, spearheaded as always by Shermans, smashed through the German lines and linked up with the defenders. The men in Bastogne had been surrounded for 7 days. They had endured artillery barrages, airstrikes, and the coldest winter in years, but they were still standing. One of the tankers who rolled into the town that day wrote simply, "We didn't rescue them. We joined them." The counter-offensive was over. What remained of Hitler's last gamble lay burning in the snow. Hundreds of tanks, thousands of trucks, and tens of thousands of men. Photographs taken in the aftermath tell the story better than any words. King Tigers blackened by fire, their thick armor warped and split. Shermans parked beside them, engines still idling, crews standing outside in frozen breath and silence. A German prisoner shivering under a blanket told his American guard, "We thought you were finished. You just don't stop." And that was the truth. The Sherman crews hadn't been the strongest or the most heavily armed. They'd been tired, freezing, and outmatched. But they had refused to stop. By January 1945, the snow began to melt, revealing the battlefield beneath, a graveyard of machines. For every American tank that burned, 2 more had taken its place. The German advance had run out of fuel, ammunition, and time. The King Tiger, for all its power, was a stranded relic of an empire collapsing under its own weight. General Eisenhower called the Ardennes the greatest American battle of the war. He wasn't speaking of tactics or technology. He was speaking of endurance. In those frozen forests, the war had turned from machines back into men, into their will to fight when everything else had failed. One tanker from the 37th Tank Battalion summed it up best. "We didn't beat them with bigger guns. We beat them because we didn't quit." When the snow finally thawed, the roads were lined with wrecks, King Tigers burned out in ditches, Panthers half buried in ice, and Shermans limping east, patched with steel, their crews unshaven, exhausted, but alive. The Ardennes had been a crucible of iron and frost. It was where the tiger met the wolf and where the wolf endured. The tide of war was turning again, and this time the cold couldn't stop it. By the dawn of 1945, Europe was a continent of ruins. From the hedgerows of France to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the ground was littered with the bones of tanks and men. The Reich was collapsing under its own weight, but the fighting wasn't over yet. Ahead lay Germany itself, the homeland, the rivers, the cities, the final line of resistance. And leading the charge toward that final frontier was the same machine that had carried the Allies from Tunisia to Normandy, the M4 Sherman. Only now it had evolved. The new variant was called the M4A3E8, or as the crews nicknamed it, the Easy 8. It was faster, smoother, and deadlier than any version before it. Fitted with a new suspension, wider tracks, and a long-barreled 76mm gun, the Easy 8 was the culmination of every lesson learned in 3 years of brutal war. It wasn't elegant, but it was perfected through blood and necessity. The German tank crews still had their Tigers and Panthers, their heavy armor and devastating guns. On paper, they were the masters of steel. But by 1945, paper meant nothing. Their fuel depots were gone. Their factories were rubble. Their once feared armored divisions were starving ghosts. A German general would later admit bitterly, "They built more tanks than we had shells. The Allies had turned war into a science of supply, and supply into an empire." Every morning, the roads behind the front lines trembled under the weight of convoys. Thousands of trucks carrying fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts stretched for miles. The Shermans rolled in endless columns, a living river of olive drab and dust. Each one painted with names from home: Chicago Bell, Thunderbolt, Texan Fury, Lucky 8. To the men inside them, the war felt both eternal and inevitable. They had been fighting for years across continents, yet now, as they advanced deeper into Germany, there was something different in the air, a sense that this was the end of it all. From the air, reconnaissance pilots described the scene as an empire of steel in motion. The Rhine River, the ancient barrier that had stopped armies for centuries, lay ahead. To cross it was to invade the heart of Germany. To reach it was to end the war. But between the Allies and the Rhine stood the last remnants of the Wehrmacht. In towns like Cologne, Remagen, and Wesel, German forces dug in with desperate determination. King Tigers guarded bridges, their 80mm guns covering every approach. On March 2, 1945, the 3rd Armored Division, the Spearhead Division, reached the outskirts of Cologne. The city lay in ruins, reduced to rubble by months of bombing. But one massive structure still stood: the Cologne Cathedral, blackened but unbroken, looming over the wreckage. In the streets below, American Shermans moved cautiously between the craters. A tiger I waited, hidden behind the rubble of a collapsed building. The duel that followed would become one of the most famous tank encounters of the war, captured on film by a combat cameraman. The Tiger fired first. Its shell punched clean through the lead Sherman, turning it into a fireball. Then, as the German tank began to turn its turret, another Sherman flanked wide through the side streets. Its gunner, Corporal Clarence Smoyer, took careful aim through the gun sight of his Easy-8 and fired. The shell struck the Tiger's turret ring. Sparks erupted, then fire. The German tank lurched forward and stopped, black smoke pouring from its hatches. The crew never escaped. That single duel, one Tiger against two Shermans, became the perfect symbol of the war's turning tide. Precision and perfection had been defeated by persistence and adaptability. By March, the Allied advance had become unstoppable. For every Tiger destroyed, 50 Shermans rolled past it. German resistance collapsed in pockets, and what remained of their once proud panzer divisions were little more than fuel-starved wrecks. A German officer wrote bitterly in his diary, "Our tanks stand silent." The Americans' tanks never stop. Across the shattered highways of the Ruhr Valley, Shermans rolled past abandoned Panthers and burned out half-tracks. Fuel shortages forced the Germans to tow their own tanks with horses. Others were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. One American observer described the sight: "They had the best tanks in the world, but they had no way to move them." The contrast was everywhere. The Shermans moved with mechanical confidence. Thousands of engines roaring in harmony, headlights cutting through the smoke of burning cities. Every time one broke down, it was repaired within hours. Every time one was destroyed, another arrived by rail from Antwerp or Cherbourg. This was not war in the traditional sense. It was industrial domination, the full force of American production unleashed across Europe. The bridges across the Rhine were the final obstacle. The Germans had destroyed nearly all of them to slow the advance. But on March 7, 1945, scouts of the 9th Armored Division reached the town of Remagen, and there, miraculously, the Ludendorff Bridge was still standing. The Germans had rigged it with explosives, but the charges had failed to detonate properly. Smoke still rose from the failed attempt as the first American Shermans appeared on the western bank. Captain Carl Timmerman, the officer in command, made the decision instantly. "We're going across," he said. At 1:50 p.m., under sniper fire and artillery bursts, the first Sherman rolled onto the bridge. Its tracks clanged against the steel plates as it rumbled forward, every man expecting it to explode at any second. But it didn't. One by one, more Shermans followed, their engines echoing like thunder across the valley. By nightfall, The Americans had established a bridgehead on the east side of the Rhine. The impossible had happened. The Allies were across. When the news reached headquarters, Eisenhower couldn't believe it. "Those damn engineers just gave us the Rhine," he said with a grin. The crossing at Remagen broke the last illusion of German defense. Hitler raged in his bunker, ordering the execution of the officers who had failed to destroy the bridge. But no order could stop the tide now. For days, the Shermans streamed over the Rhine, hundreds, then thousands. Onlookers described it as a living river of armor, stretching as far as the eye could see. The bridge sagged under the weight, cables snapping, yet the tanks kept coming. One American private wrote in his diary, "The bridge shook like it would fall, but we just kept rolling. We weren't going to stop for anything." When the Ludendorff Bridge finally collapsed 10 days later, it no longer mattered. The Allies already had multiple crossings established, and the Shermans were deep inside Germany. By late March, the German army was in full retreat. Cities surrendered without a fight. Entire panzer battalions were found abandoned, their crews gone, their tanks out of fuel. Aerial footage from the time shows endless columns of Shermans rolling over pontoon bridges, moving east through shattered towns. The Rhine, once the symbol of German invincibility, had become a highway for American armor. In one captured letter, a German general wrote to his superior, "The enemy's strength is not their tanks, but their factories. They fight with the strength of a continent. We fight with what remains of a nation." He wasn't wrong. By April 1945, the Sherman had become more than just a tank. It was the embodiment of Allied resolve. The machine that had once been mocked for its simplicity was now the spear that shattered an empire. When the columns crossed the Rhine, they didn't just cross a river, they crossed into history. Behind them lay the wreckage of every ideology that claimed perfection could outlast persistence. As the Shermans rolled toward the heart of Germany, the men inside could feel it. The end. The road ahead led not to another battle, but to victory. The Empire of Steel had reached its peak, and as the sun set over the Rhine, its waters reflected the glow of burning cities and the silhouettes of tanks rolling east, the sound of engines blending with the distant echo of a war almost won. The machine that wouldn't die had become the machine that ended the war. When the guns finally fell silent in May of 1945, Europe was a graveyard of machines. The fields of Normandy, the forests of the Ardennes, and the ruins of Berlin were littered with steel. Burnt-out Tigers, shattered Panthers, and row upon row of Shermans resting where they had stopped. The war was over, but the echoes of their engines would never fade. In the years that followed, the survivors, the men who had fought inside those tanks, began to speak. Historians interviewed them, soldiers wrote memoirs, and from both sides of the line a strange respect began to emerge. German veterans who had once laughed at the Sherman now spoke of it with wary admiration. Otto Carius, one of Germany's greatest tank aces, who destroyed over 150 enemy vehicles during the war, wrote in his memoir, Tigers in the Mud, "We had the better tanks, yes, but they had the better system. Their tanks were always there, repaired, replaced, ready. You could destroy 10, 20, 50, and it made no difference. More would always come." Another veteran, when asked what it was like to fight the Shermans, paused for a long moment before answering, "You didn't fear one Sherman. You feared the sound of many. They fought like an ocean. You couldn't stop the tide." Even General Heinz Guderian, the father of German Blitzkrieg, later admitted in his reflections that the Americans had mastered what Germany could not: the unification of industry, logistics, and combat. "The Sherman was not the best tank," he said, "but it was the right one for the war America fought." That single sentence became the epitaph for the machine. The Sherman had never been a champion of specifications. It was not built to intimidate, nor to outgun, nor to win duels on open plains. It was built to endure, to move, to adapt, and to arrive faster than the enemy could react. In the final count, more than 49,000 Shermans rolled off Allied production lines. By comparison, Germany produced just over 1,300 Tigers. It was the clearest expression of industrial philosophy ever written in steel. For every Tiger that was a masterpiece, there were 50 Shermans, each a testament to a different kind of brilliance, not perfection, But persistence, the German crews knew it. As the war dragged on, they faced the same terrifying sight again and again, the endless columns of olive-drab tanks moving through the smoke. They called it Die Eiserne Lawine, the Iron Avalanche. That avalanche broke the Wehrmacht. It didn't win because it was stronger. It won because it was unstoppable. After the war, the Sherman didn't fade into history. It simply changed uniforms. Thousands of them were shipped to Allied nations, reborn in new armies, fighting new wars. In Korea, the Sherman's silhouette once again appeared on the ridgelines. Against North Korean T-34s, the old warhorse fought on. Its 76mm gun still lethal, its engine still steady. In Israel's War of Independence, Shermans fought under the desert sun once more, wearing new markings, but the same determination. In museums across the world today, from Bovington to Fort Benning to Saumur, Shermans stand in silence, their paint faded, their armor pitted. Children climb on their tracks, veterans place their hands on cold steel, and tour guides tell the story of the tank that changed the world. It's hard to imagine now, looking at its rounded turret and humble lines, that this unassuming machine once carried the weight of an entire continent's hopes. The men who served in them never forgot what it felt like, the engine's vibration under their boots, the acrid smell of oil and cordite, the rattle of spent shell casings on steel. For them, the Sherman was more than a machine. It was home. It was survival. It was the friend that carried them through hell and brought them back alive. Private James O'Donnell, who fought in the 3rd Armored Division from Normandy to the Elbe, said it best. You didn't love it because it was perfect. You loved it because it got you home. In the post-war years, engineers and historians dissected its design. They pointed out its weaknesses, its thin armor, its high profile, its early tendency to catch fire. They compared it endlessly to the Tiger, the Panther, the T-34. But no statistic, no gun caliber, no armor thickness could capture what made the Sherman immortal. It wasn't a tank built to dominate. It was a tank built to endure. Every part of it, every bolt, gear, and bearing was designed not for glory, but for practicality. And in that practicality lay its genius. It was the first truly global tank, a weapon built not by soldiers, but by an entire civilization working in unity. The factories of Detroit, the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the oil fields of Texas, the shipyards of New York, all poured their labor into one purpose: movement. The Sherman was the embodiment of that movement, the physical manifestation of America's relentless forward march. And when the war was done, when the smoke cleared and the flags were raised, it became a symbol of something greater than victory. It became a symbol of persistence itself. Today, when historians describe the Second World War, they often speak of strategies, generals, and great battles. But behind every victory, from Alamein to Normandy, from Bastogne to Berlin, there was the same sound. The steady rumble of Shermans moving forward. Their tracks carved the path that would lead to peace. One German general, years after the war, stood in front of a Sherman at a memorial site and simply said, "We underestimated them. Not the machines, the people who built them." He was right, because the story of the Sherman is not just the story of a tank, it's the story of the people who refused to quit. The men who drove it, the workers who built it, the mechanics who repaired it under fire. Together, they created something more powerful than any gun. The idea that persistence itself can win wars. From mockery to memory, from the deserts of Tunisia to the streets of Berlin, the Sherman became the most human of machines, flawed, stubborn, and enduring. In the end, all that mattered was not its armor or its firepower, but its heart, the endless rhythm of engines that refused to stop until the war was done. They laughed at its thin armor and short gun barrel. They stopped laughing when they realized the Shermans didn't fight to be perfect. They fought to be everywhere. And that's why they won. If you still hear the echoes of their engines, if you can imagine the thunder of tracks across Europe and the courage of the men inside them, then their story isn't over. History remembers the victors, but legacy belongs to those who endure. Subscribe for more untold stories of courage, steel, and the machines that shaped our world.